I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And
we're the Trade Guys.
Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. This is Trade Guy Scott. On July 17th, Bill and I appeared at the 2024 Policy Forum of the US-PECC Economic Council. At this event, we were joined by friend of the program Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. The three of us discussed the presidential contest and the U.S. trade agenda for 2025 and beyond. We hope you enjoy this recording of The Trade Guys Live.
Welcome. We're going to do our Trade Guys podcast live. I hope many of you are listeners. If you are, you'll hear it probably next week whenever we get around to producing it. We're going to go for the normal length of the podcast, which is give or take 30 minutes. We're delighted to have a special guest with us. We occasionally have guests, as you listeners know, and we're particularly happy to have this one, who is Wendy Cutler, who is the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, longtime trade negotiator and acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. I got to know Wendy, actually, when I was a lobbyist running the National Foreign Trade Council, and it appeared that she was assigned to be the person to call me in and complain every time I said something that the U.S. Trade Representative didn't like, which was fairly often. So we'd have a meeting in her office, and I would explain why he was wrong, and she would explain why I was wrong, and then we'd go back out and go our separate ways. But I always felt kind of sorry for you, and I assume you had a long list of people in addition to me that you had to
You kept me really busy.
Anyway, she was then and is now, I think, one of the most astute commentators that we've got on trade policy generally, and particularly on trade policy in Asia, given her current position at the Asia Society Policy Institute. So we're very happy to have her. Unfortunately, our normal moderator, Andrew Schwartz, has been called away with a media emergency, so it is just us. I'm going to ask the questions, but I'm also going to answer some of them because Scott and I are both the trade guys, and it wouldn't be any fun if all I had to do was ask the questions. Although the nice thing is I don't have to answer the ones that I don't know anything about. So we've got three topics like usual, and the topics are basically trade after the election, IPEF, and USMCA renewal, which we think is going to be relevant to some issues in the region, particularly China, which I think will be a topic. But we'll start with the one that's most fun, which is the election. I'm not going to ask who's going to win. That would be unfair. And I think, in my view, this is like a Shakespearean play. You know, whether it's a tragedy or a comedy, we'll see. But it's 5 acts either way, and we're probably in Act 2. So there's a long way to go, and I'm not going to ask Wendy or Scott to speculate on who's going to win. But I am going to ask them to speculate on what's going to happen for both of them, regardless of who wins. There's going to be a president. There's going to be a trade policy. This is a case where you've seen both of them for 4 years, or nearly 4. So you've got some sense of what's going on. So let's start with Wendy. Go in either order you want, but what do you see happening in the trade policy for the next administration?
Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be with the Trade Guys. I think I did this a few years ago, and so glad to be invited back. So
don't do that for everybody, you know. A lot of one-timers, but we're happy to have you.
Given that the Republicans are holding their national convention this week, let me start with just some observations about what a trade policy could look under a second Trump administration. And for me, I think one of the things that just comes to mind right away is that trade policy is going to be high on the priority list. I think a lot of us felt that trade was kind of marginalized during the Biden administration and in many ways played a supporting role, and very few new initiatives, particularly market opening initiatives. So that's number one. Number two, is that all good? Because this is going to change things, and I think going to all be focusing again on bilateral trade deficits. And I had my team the other day just pull out a list of our top 10 trading partners with large deficits. No surprises there, except for me. I think the increase in our deficits with Canada and Mexico really stuck out. And I think we'll get to that during the USMCA review, because I think that will be a key objective of a Trump administration in a review and improvement of that agreement. Also, I think an important distinction will be the weight and value placed on working with allies and partners, particularly in trying to deal with the China challenge. And in particular, if the Trump administration, as stated, goes forward immediately or within the first few weeks or months with a universal 10% tariff hike against all countries, all products, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult to rally their enthusiasm to work with us collectively on addressing the China challenge. In a Biden second term, I think we'll see a lot of continuity. I have some hope that we may see a more active trade policy. It's going to all be relative, but perhaps we'll see some efforts to pursue some market opening objectives, even if in a very limited way with respect to a sector or a possible FTA with a certain country or an economy. But for the most part, I don't see us going back to where we were.
Well, in thinking about this, I recall that there are the occasional rematches in American presidential politics. They don't happen often. They haven't happened recently. But there have been a number of rematches, which is somewhat easier for a talking head to handicap when you really get down to it. Everybody wants to say something new. It's been 132 years since we had an election in which both major party candidates had served as president. It was the version 2 of Grover Cleveland versus Benjamin Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison defeated Cleveland in 1888 on the tariff. Cleveland, the Democrat, was the governor of New York and a free trader. People didn't really like what they got under Harrison's administration, and the rematch went to Cleveland. But it's been 132 years. Now, two other interesting moments that I'll mention. First, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt was campaigning for the office of president and was shot during the campaign, during a speech, which he finished the speech before seeking medical aid. That was 1912. Anybody recall what city that happened in? Milwaukee, correct. So in any case, and then third, the most recent rematch in American history is 68 years ago. It was the 1956 contest between Eisenhower seeking re-election and Stevenson. Now, I think what happened in that one is Eisenhower was so popular and so unlikely to lose the election that the Democrats wisely put up a tomato can that had lost the first time and just had him take one for the team. But that said, there's an interesting thing about rematches, and that is that the past is prologue. So you want to know what you're going to get in Trump 2.0? What you got in Trump 1.0. Okay? And you can expect continuity in the Biden administration if President Biden is reelected. That's got to be the baseline. They're doing things. They had 4 years in the office. They did the things they wanted to do. This is what you get. Let me step back a minute and talk about the broader economic policy. I do think that you'll see a lot of the same kind of Trump messaging and framing should former President Trump win the election. I think we'll be back to that narrative of win-lose. We'll be back to the narrative of unfairness. Wendy gave good advice. Check your bilateral merchandise trade deficit or surplus with the United States. It will drive how many phone calls you get from a Trump administration.
Or
visits, yeah. Okay, and we tend to laugh that off, but the president doesn't. You know, he looked at Europe and didn't care about the European Union or the single market. He cared about Germany and was ridiculed by so-called trade professionals. But once again, read Selena Zito. Selena Zito was a correspondent for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and as a columnist, she was 2 rows behind the president in Butler, Pennsylvania. So she follows the campaign very closely. One of the things she said that everybody ignored during the 2016 run was Trump's supporters take him seriously but not literally. Trump's opponents take him literally but not seriously. And I thought that was a useful distinction in terms of interpreting the messaging. So what you'll have is a deal maker who sees trade as win-lose instead of win-win, and will go after the things that represent unfairness because that's the part of the narrative. Stepping back, you'll have broader economic policy issues, of which trade is a smaller part. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, done under reconciliation, 10-year life, going to expire in the next president's term. So what happens on tax policy is going to be a big deal. Finally, one of the things I've noticed, I'm an consumer products marketer, many of you who know me know that, and I've always been impressed by the power of nostalgia in advertising and marketing. And if you think about it, separate the politics out of it, the red hats, Make America Great Again is a nostalgic idea. A lot of it's emotional power. Power is a political idea. It's the one thing's the way they were. Now, nostalgia has natural limits, and this is the final comment about the 10% tariff funding the federal government. In 1900, the entire spending of the United States federal government was what percent of GDP? 2.7. It's now well over 20. Nobody in Washington is talking about spending less. I mean, it's a shock when somebody raises the issue of maybe getting back to 2018 spending levels in the federal government. I mean, we can't even envision that ourselves. But to get from 23% or whatever it is today to under 3%, at which time you could have realistically funded the federal government from tariffs and excise taxes, which is what they had in 1900. Good luck. Much like migration will be limited by the workforce size and what's needed to run the country. Tariff hikes to fund the government will be conditioned by and affected by the degree to which you can actually get a government small enough, which you can't. So I don't think you can, at least not in 4 years, or not without great catastrophe. Add that to Article 1, Section 8, that gives the Congress an enumerated power of managing foreign commerce. I think there are a lot of hurdles to it. Now, can a president increase tariffs via emergency action? Yes, he or she can. And Richard Nixon did it in 1971 when he closed the gold window. The United States was in the middle of a balance of payments crisis, and tariff increases were part of the deal to get the economy from tanking in a massive way. So yes, it can be done. Will it stick? Who knows what sticks these days. But in any case, key is take with what you've seen. That's what's going to happen in the next 4 years as a baseline, and don't worry about the rest.
Well, let me a couple of things, make a comment about something Wendy said and ask a question. My view has been Biden more of the same, not for the same reason, for a different reason. I think the Democrats' policy is political. It's designed to prevent an intra-party battle between the Democratic left and the Democratic center, which was a feature of the TPP. It was actually a feature of NAFTA, but it was a big feature of TPP. I think they decided early they didn't want to do that again. The consequence of that is that you outsource your trade policy to your left wing. You don't do everything they want, but you don't do what they're against. And what they're against are market access agreements, among other things. And the politics hasn't changed. The left is still there, the center is still there, and they'll be there after the election. So I don't see much changing. I think with Trump, they've summarized it very well. Keep in mind, he does change his mind on occasion. He does listen to other people, but trade is unique. He's had the same views for 40 years, and they haven't changed. And they're not going to change. He wrote a book about this in 1985, as I recall. And here we are. He's still saying the same thing. He has one metric, the bilateral trade deficit, which they both already commented, one tool, which is tariffs, and one narrative, which is the U.S. is a victim of evil foreigners trying to undermine our economy and steal our jobs. If you have any doubts about that part of the narrative, listen to what J.D. Vance has been saying along the same lines. That's the narrative. That leads him to the policies that he's been talking about. I'd add two things. One, the thing that's depressing about this is when I talk to companies, which means some of you out there, particularly you people, but people in companies, tend to get is, yeah, his trade policy is terrible, talking about Trump, but we love his tax policy, and we love his regulatory policy. And we'll swallow the trade policy to get the other stuff. So in a way, I was asked this morning, inconveniently at 7 a.m., at a call with mostly Europeans, or whether it was going to be a giant business wall of resistance against the 10% tariff or the China tariffs. I thought not, because business in the past has been willing to surrender on that because they like the other parts of his policy, which also haven't changed. Low taxes, tax cuts, regardless of the deficit that's going to create, deregulation, ending climate activities, wind. He doesn't like wind. Odd for a politician, but he doesn't like wind. So I get plaintively asked by foreigners who come in to visit, when is the United States going to go back to a, quote, normal, unquote, trade policy? When are we going to get back to market access and trade liberalization? And my answer has been somewhere between 4 years and never, because I don't think either candidate right now is in the mood to do anything. Ask you to respond to that piece of it. Looking longer term than the next 4 years, do you see it changing, or are we now permanently on a step back from globalization, take care of ourselves track?
I mean, my view is, look, things are shifting. The world is so different than 10 years ago, and even different than the world during Trump's first term. And so we're not going to go back to where we were. I think the question for me is, can we do a better job in kind of merging our economic security agenda with the market opening trade agenda? It seems like it's either or now, and I don't think that's the right way to look at these issues. I think you can do both at the same time if you do them well.
I wouldn't say it's either or. It seems to me they've been put together.
Yes, and that's how I look at it, is they put the two together and they are misfits. Okay, in fact, sometimes you can make national security, international security decisions worse by coupling them with economic cooperation. So there's a lot that goes on there. Here's one thing that might happen or might not happen in the next 4 years. As someone who's old enough to have lived through the 70s stagflation, I'm kind of wondering when Americans lose their appetite for industrial policy. And I don't know how fast that's going to happen. We seem to be happy with it. We're at the happy stage of industrial policy. We're at the stage when people get lots of money handed to them by the feds, and they have ribbon-cutting ceremonies and all this. But instead of letting the market allocate capital, you let the government allocate capital. Not everything works, and the government gets blamed. That's the nature of these things. The question is how quickly they do. So, for instance, I saw some polling information from a leading researcher working exclusively for Democratic candidates, and he had his typical 100-slide PowerPoint deck, but as he asked for concluding remarks, he had one red line. He said, "Do not talk about electric cars." He said, if you mention electric cars in your stump speech, the people listening to you will vote for your opponent. The last time we had an idea that tested this bad in the United States was defund the police. This is a Democratic consultant. He gets paid to talk to people and distill it down for candidates. Okay? So what that says to me is there's some things shifting out there that we're not noticing in Washington, not paying attention to, that will be decisive in terms of how long industrial policy and really the voters' appetite for industrial policy will last. I don't know the answer.
If I can add too, I think we need to look at tariffs differently now as well, particularly as Chinese companies are beginning to invest all around the world. That the tariffs Trump wants to put in, the 60% or the 200% on electric vehicles from Mexico, those are tariffs on products from China to the United States. But as Chinese companies invest around the world, and particularly if they meet the rules of origin requirements of that country, they can benefit from either FTA benefits or even our MFN tariff. So I think in a Trump administration and a Biden administration, they'll both need to look at new tools and look beyond tariffs.
What are the other tools they might look at?
Well, for example, trying to restrict imports from Chinese companies versus imports of Chinese origin products.
But the tool ends up still being a tariff, right? Or just a sanction?
It could be a prohibition. We could say no products from Chinese companies can come into the United States. The Biden administration, even when they recently announced their tariff hikes, they're talking about how they're looking at new tools. Again, I think the Trump administration will also need to look at tools beyond these kind of bilateral tariffs and, frankly, these bilateral agreements, because it's going to be harder and harder to get at these unfair trade practices as the global landscape changes.
Scott, do you want to add?
I think that's right. I think that there will be broader aspects to it, but I agree with Wendy that we're really out of steam on a lot of tools. That is also true on the sanctions side. Been doing some work recently on financial sanctions, and they're becoming less and less effective. At the same time, we're essentially manufacturing alternatives to settlements of trade in dollars, things like that. So, look, this is an election between two people who are eligible for Social Security and Medicare, all right? We're clearly out of ideas. Okay, otherwise we'd have younger candidates, right? So we got a bigger problem. But that problem is reflected in sanctions policy, it's reflected in trade policy, it's reflected in security policy. So Neil Ferguson calls this the Soviet era of American politics, late Soviet, yes, but I wouldn't go that far. But
I just say on the sanctions issue, the standard story about sanctions is they're most effective until you pull the trigger.
yeah.
And once you pull the trigger, all that you then do is create a cottage industry of people who specialize in getting around them, which is exactly what we're seeing right now.
That was Gary Huffbauer's famous title, right? Feeling good with not doing good.
Yeah, well, that's been the experience. And the current argument has been the more you use them, the more you create exactly the problem that we're talking about and the less valuable they become going forward. I did want to disagree with Wendy about one thing and then ask for comments, and then we've driven this one to the ground. We'll have to go on to IPEF. But on the multilateral issue, you were talking about how to create multilateral cooperation. And it just seemed to me that one of the biggest differences between the two candidates is on this issue. Biden is a genuine multilateralist. I wouldn't say that he has always successfully done that, but he believes in it. Trump is a unilateralist. I think Trump doesn't care if the Europeans follow us. He thinks we'll take care of it ourselves.
Right, but some of his cabinet's going to be looking to partners to work on issues with China. But I agree, for Trump himself, he views things bilaterally, us against them, win-lose, etc.
Zero sum.
But I would also say, if you ask some of our WTO partners, if Biden's a multilateralist, I think you'd get a range of answers.
Well, yes, you would get a range of answers, but one of the things that I think we can all agree on that we've said on the podcast before is that in the WTO, there's no rule against hypocrisy. Right now, you have an administration that supports the WTO verbally, but undermines it at most opportunities, as opposed to a candidate that may very well drop out of it. That's what this morning's call was about. People are worried. Anyway, let's spend a few minutes on IPEF, which is something that I know has been a topic of discussion here at the conference where we're privileged to appear. Let's just ask the overarching question. So we've got 3 pillars done, more or less, on their way to implementation, not always at the same pace. One pillar whose status is complicated. And so let's start with Wendy. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen on Pillar 1, and what's going to happen to the rest of it? Is this going to be a real thing or not?
Okay, so Pillar 1, the trade pillar, is now basically on hold until after the election. I think if Biden wins, there will be a real push to conclude work in that area as quickly as possible. One area, though, where I think will not be ripe for a conclusion is the area of digital trade, because I think the Biden administration would still need to sort out where they're going to come out on. But I think there will be a push to get the trade pillar in place and to start implementing it. On the other pillars, progress is being made, particularly in the supply chain pillar. They're having meetings, they're setting up the councils and different groups called for in the agreement. In my view, this is all a step forward. It's important, but it's an insufficient, inadequate regional economic agenda at a time when the countries and economies in the region are forging not only FTAs between themselves, but are coming up with new rules, whether on digital. Just this past couple of weeks, New Zealand and a number of countries announced a new agreement on the environment, and I think you're going to see more and more of that in the region, and our input will not be reflected.
Scott?
Look, I think it's important that all the economies in the Asia-Pacific remain pragmatic, as you've always been over the years. It's been a place where people have found ways to do business. I think the IPEF is, first of all, I'm quite skeptical that in a second Biden administration that the whole thing moves beyond polite information sharing because of the intensity against bargaining. Trump has already named it TPP, so it's over. Don't book hotels too far in advance. We had this conversation. This is a perfect example of literally versus seriously. Both Bill and Wendy objected to my characterization that I thought TPP was brilliant. But it's brilliant because Trump tied it to a past failed initiative that no one would support and no one liked in his relevant set. Neither party was able to get behind it. We had 3 candidates that got a lot of votes in 2016, and all 3 of them wound up being against TPP. So what he's done is pick the shorthand. And yes, Wendy and Bill carefully explained why IPEF was not TPP. And all I'm saying is Trump called it TPP because he intends to kill it.
TPP-2, right?
Yeah, TPP-2 because he intends to kill it dead, all right? Don't confuse yourself with whether or not it's TPP. It's not a debate worth having. So if any of you bought long lead hotel rooms or anything like that for meetings, good luck.
This is one of those issues where, as it happens frequently in the trade, where the left and the right end up shooting the center. And that's what's going on here. Because one of the things that amused me about IPEF is when it was first announced as a better approach than TPP, there were press releases issued by a variety of NGOs in Asia, not just here, but in a number of Asian countries, saying this is just TPP in disguise. This is as objectionable as the one that we objected to before, coming from the left, and saying exactly what Trump is saying. So I think you're right, he'll kill it. Whether it's already dead is sort of what we're discussing here, but there seems to be, I think certainly in this room, some hope that it's going to become
So
meaningful.
just a technical point here, which I think is interesting, that in the pillar on anti-corruption and the pillar on supply chains, if you read the provisions for withdrawal from the agreement, you cannot legally withdraw from the agreement until 3 years from entry into force. It's different on the decarbonization pillar. I don't think that will stop Trump, but I think that negotiators maybe had a Trump victory in mind.
That's interesting, because what you're also beginning to see as panic sets in the trade community is how do we indemnify ourselves from the forthcoming Trump administration.
I think this was IPEF's attempt.
Yeah, well,
Good luck.
You saw a different version of this yesterday when a large number of African countries have proposed formally for discussion, I think next week at the WTO, accelerating the process of selecting the next Director General. Dr. Ngozi's term doesn't expire until September of 2025, and whether she wants to run again or not, the normal process would really begin at the beginning of next year, because it's like a 9-month process, put all the pieces together. And it's in the rules. I mean, this is all sort of specified. But the Africans have said, let's accelerate that process, because we all want Dr. Ngozi to have a second term. She hasn't said that she wants a second term, but she hasn't said she doesn't. And this is being widely perceived, that's what my call this morning was about, is widely being perceived as an effort, at least by them, to get the WTO ready for the next 4 years, because they remember when she was being selected that the Trump administration and Ambassador Lighthizer opposed her and supported the Korean candidate and blocked her selection, which was not made official until after Biden had taken office. So you're going to see, not just random, you're going to see, I think, a growing number of people figuring out what do we need to do to make sure that we've got stuff done before he comes in. On the WTO side, the obvious question is, can they get a fisheries agreement done next week? And I think the answer is maybe, maybe not. There's been a lot of progress, but there is no clear sign from the biggest problem country, India, that anything has changed. We have only a couple minutes left before we go to Q&A, so let me ask a quick question about USMCA renewal. This is mandated by the agreement to have a full-scale review in 2026, at which point the parties have to decide whether or not they want to extend it, as I recall, for 16 years. And if they don't decide to do that, then it goes away after 10, which leaves plenty of time to reconsider, regardless of the outcome. But let me ask you a little bit about what you're expecting for this, because this is starting to appear on people's radar screens. We've got I was going to say a boatload, but it's probably a rowboat load of bilateral trade issues amongst the three countries. So we have a dairy problem with Canada. We have actually agriculture issues with both of them. We have lumber with Canada. We have energy with Mexico. We have labor and autos with Mexico, I think. And Canadians are concerned about our auto rules, too. So there's a bunch of those. I guess Canada Digital, thank you. Yes, the DST and the content rule. What are you expecting the renewal to focus on? Is it going to focus just on this pile of specific bilateral issues that have come up, or is it going to focus on larger, bigger things?
So I think for any trade policy person, we all need to start paying attention to this review now, even though the review technically happens on the 6th anniversary of entry into force, which is July 2026. In order for us domestically to come up with our positions and share them with Congress, a lot of this work will happen in 2025. I think under a Trump administration, this is going to be a mega review, and I think there's going to be a lot of drama. I think, number one, there'll be a focus on why Canada and Mexico's bilateral trade deficits have increased dramatically since the conclusion of the agreement, and that will lead to proposals by the U.S. to deal with that. Second, the whole issue of China, where I bring in kind of rules of origin, electric vehicles, even though I'm not supposed to say that, I guess.
You just don't say it when you're campaigning for office.
You can say batteries,
You can say
batteries
now.
if you want.
Batteries, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I think the whole China issue is going to be a big focus of USMCA. And remember, there is a provision in USMCA now about what would happen if Mexico or Canada were to enter into a trade agreement with a non-market economy. But I think the China issue now is going to be a lot broader, including looking at how to restrict imports from Chinese companies that are investing in Mexico. I think there'll be an effort, as you said, to resolve these outstanding bilateral issues, but by doing that through new language to kind of tighten the rules. And I suspect the Trump administration is going to dust off a lot of the proposals that didn't go through 4 years ago to see if they can push them now. But remember, for the Trump administration, the sunset review, and that's morphed into this kind of review, 16-year review, was a major priority and really part of their platform on trade, that we shouldn't lock ourselves into these commitments, that the world changes, our trade balances changes, and we need to flexibly be able to deal with these issues. But I also think under a Biden administration, this is going to be a very serious undertaking, probably with the China issues moving to the top, along with agriculture and the other bilateral disputes and rules of origin.
Scott?
I'm going to give advice to people who will go do these things, because I don't anymore. I moved to the South, pulled my pants up to my armpits, and I complain about the government full time. But those of you who are engaged in advocacy in Washington, this will need your attention on both a political and a, call it, technical level. Don't focus only on the technical disputes between the United States and Canada and Mexico. They're important, but the pivotal thing is USMCA changed the politics. You want to understand why and how to make it change for the better in the future. Look, 90% of that agreement didn't change at all between NAFTA and USMCA. I know a lot of the businesses I've worked on had no change in any of the provisions, and yet the original NAFTA with its accession clause was radioactive. Nobody dared accede to NAFTA. Now with this sunset clause in USMCA, first everybody thinks it's the model agreement. We have Democratic senators make floor speeches about wanting countries to be able to accede to the USMCA. Politics have changed. Understand why and understand what they're going to have to be in the scene. Because I think it's the politics of North American integration that have to be dealt with constructively to be able to have the agreement go forward in a way that keeps the 90% that's working really, really well manageable. So
I just reinforce something that Wendy said. I suspect one of the big issues will be the increasing temptation to use Mexico as a platform for access to the United States. As we employ tariffs, like China tariffs, if Trump puts those in, the obvious thing to do is, if you're a Chinese manufacturer, is you move to a third country and manufacture from there. Right. You've seen this happen in solar panels. You've seen it happen in a lot of countries. Mexico is, if you're Chinese, it can be an attractive platform for you. It solves a lot of logistical problems. There's a workforce. There's an experienced workforce in the northern part of the country and working in manufacturing that meets American standards. And I think both administrations, or either administration, is probably going to feel that politically they'll be compelled to do something about that. And for the Mexicans, that means big implications for investment coming into Mexico. So I think that's going to end up being the big issue. That's about time. And you want to add anything?
Just one thing on the accession provisions, the issue of accessions to USMCA. As far as I know, there's no accession provision in USMCA.
That's correct.
You mean for other countries?
They took it out. Actively, they took it out. And so even though Costa Rica and other countries may be interested in joining, and there may be some in Congress that are interested in having more countries join, I don't think that's a given at all. In fact, I would argue it could almost be negative, particularly for a Trump administration, if it dilutes North American production. In other words, if more countries come in, then all of their inputs would then contribute toward the rule of origin under a traditional trade agreement. And therefore, maybe you wouldn't want other countries in because you want more production among the three countries.
With that, I thank you. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for inviting us and having us here with you. And I hope you have a successful conference.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.